Welcome to this edition of the Virtual Faith and Freedom Tour. We want to welcome you back, and Dr. Lillback, it appears that we brought our viewers to an empty lot. What is this place?
Well, you're a great tour guide. You know what you're doing.
Well, I'd like to think so, but there's a tree? What else? What is this place?
Well, actually, this is Welcome Park. It's named for the ship on which William Penn traveled when he came to visit this proprietary colony named after his family, Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods. And this lot, as you look out across it, you'll see a network of white lines. This represents a planned city. Philadelphia, as Penn will say, was named before she was born. He drew the street names and named them all and said, this is going to be a planned city, planned not only for commerce and for dignity and beauty, but also for religious liberty. And so Philadelphia is a city where brothers love each other, in part because it's urban planned. And that's what this place, Welcome Park, is representing. It shows the grid, and it has William Penn in the middle, presiding as an image of his house, a great place to tell his story.
Well, that's excellent. And so was his house in this place?
That's exactly right. There was an old slate roof house that was here where the proprietor, the governor of this vast expanse of 300 miles by 150 miles, today called Pennsylvania, had his headquarters. He lived here for a couple of years. Later, when he came back a second time, up at Pennsbury, he built a lovely estate on a massive piece of property. Sadly, Penn was only able to stay for a couple or 3 years each of his visits. So most of his work was done in Europe for the benefit of this colony. But he was here a couple times, and this was his first homestead.
And after he passed away, was it not his wife or his sister? Who was it that actually ended up being in charge or being the primary proprietor?
That's right. Well, William Penn got into business trouble. It's amazing. This was a big business enterprise. His chief person, his accountant that he trusted, accused him of owing a lot of money, and there's some real malfeasance by his employee. He got him in trouble. He went to debtor's prison. He almost sold Pennsylvania, and then he had a stroke at the end of his life. And his wife, which is his second wife, took over. And if it wasn't for Mrs. Penn II, well, there would not have been this great story that we know as Pennsylvania, because all of his work almost evaporated with his personal struggles, his health, but she rescued it. So in the Reagan administration, it's exciting to know that William Penn and his second wife were made citizens of the United States posthumously. So they are actually American citizens. Mrs. Penn and Mr. Penn, they belong to us, as well as United Kingdom, but we claim them as our own.
Now, the state of Pennsylvania means Penn's Woods. Is that right. What that means? But it actually was not named after him. It was named after his father. Is that correct?
That is well said, but the story goes like this. While there was a long struggle between father and son, at the end of the life of Admiral Penn, his father, he was reconciled with his son and said, I want you to be my heir. And the king owed a great debt to Admiral Penn for raising a navy to defend him in the English Civil War and all the things that had gone on. And so Penn was able to say, well, I don't want any money, just pay me in land. I hear there's land across the ocean, give it away. It's a great thing for a king with a cash flow problem. He didn't have to come up with any gold. He could give land, and by the way, he whispered, we'd get rid of all those crazy Quakers. They'll all go over there. And so it sounded like a real deal. So the bottom line then is Penn said, that's wonderful, I'll take this land. And the king said it will be called Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods. And William Penn said, you can't name it for me. I'm a Quaker. It'll be considered arrogance and pride. I'm committed to humility and plain, simple Christian living. And of course the king said, what I've written, I've written.
So it was too late.
It's too late. And so Penn said, well, let it henceforth be known that it's not named for me, but it's named for my father. So technically, it was named for William Penn, but Penn said, no, it's named for my father. So Pennsylvania Woods. And of course, if you drive across Pennsylvania to this day, its mountains and magnificent forests are in front of you to this very time. It's a spectacular name, Penn's Woods, named for his father, Admiral Penn.
And it's appropriate that we're in front of a tree, because Philadelphia is full of trees also.
That's right.
There's
well,
a lot of trees.
If you go along the road, some of them are named for trees.
That's right. That's right. So walnut and locust and chestnut. So
there you go.
Yeah.
And so the names of the trees were important. And one of the things when Penn wrote up the rules for Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia, he said he wanted it to be a green country town. So it required a certain number of acres would always be kept in just natural forests. So planned roads, planned forests, planned name, Philadelphia, the Greek language meaning love of brothers. There's a great story how that comes about. But I always like to say this, whether you root for the Eagles or not, if you're a Christian, you have to be a Philadelphian. The reason is not only there was a church of Jesus Christ named Philadelphia in the Bible, but in Romans 12, when Paul describes the qualities of the Christian life, one of them is we're to have brotherly love. When you look at the Greek language, it's Philadelphia. Welcome, Philadelphia.
Thank you, sir. Well, we want to continue our discussion of William Penn, but for our purposes, I suppose his Quaker background and how that influenced all that he stood for and how he established this colony, but particularly his commitment to religious freedom. So on the statue of him over there, we should go visit Mr. Penn. And but there's a marvelous prayer that he has there on one of his right before he left for one of his voyages back to London. We should go take a look at that prayer.
I would hope you would actually read that prayer and make it a prayer for our nation. And as you do, it's important to remember that Penn was raised not only to be a courtier, a statesman, but he also felt a call for ministry. He was trained in theology, and he became a Quaker preacher. Plus, he'd studied law. Can you imagine that? A political, legal theologian who did colonial work. So he can pray like a preacher because he was.
Well, let's go find out what he prayed.
Okay.
All right, let's go. Whoa, Dr. Lillback, here we are. We're in front of the gentleman himself. Here's William Penn, and I believe this is the exact replica of the image of William Penn that adorns the top of the City Hall of Philadelphia.
Well, let's say it's a replica, but not exact, because that one is 22 feet tall, and this one is about 5 feet tall, so it's quite a bit bigger. But it's the same image, and as you look at it, you can see some distinctive qualities. First of all, that broad brim hat. We're going to have to talk about it. In fact, I'm glad you're wearing a hat because I'm going to borrow it in a minute, okay?
Okay.
And then you look at it, his hand is being held out, and that's in the direction of bringing his blessing on Penn's Landing. He's reaching in the direction where he landed in the area of Philadelphia. And so he is coming to be the man of peace to establish a city named before it was born. And the prayer that he gives when he leaves the city is on the backside of this monument, which I think you ought to pray as a pastor who can see the theology. Would you do that? Well, let's talk a little bit about why Penn was such an extraordinary person. First of all, he was trained to be a leader. He had the finest education. He was trained in theological context. Way back, born in 1644, so he lived through the English Civil War era. And he went to Oxford University and he studied under one of the world's greatest Puritan theologians. His name is John Owen. People still talk about him to this day.
We still read his books.
And he was at this school where you also have heard of John Locke, who had influence on the American views of politics. Well,
well, actually, most of our founders were well familiar with the writings of John Locke.
That's right. So this is the milieu in which Penn was educated. From a admiral's family, has this wonderful time. But because of the English Civil War, when he went to school, it was the time when the Puritans were in charge. But as the ending of his training came along, Charles II came back, and he was not happy because the Puritans had chopped off the head of Charles I.
His father.
His father. And he said, I don't like this Puritan stuff, kind of almost Presbyterian. We don't like this Reformed Calvinism. We want Anglicanism, which is almost Roman Catholic. So it was a struggle. And so one of the things that happened with the Restoration, with the ending of Oliver Cromwell's reign, is we're going to return back to the vestments, the clothing that's required of a student who's in the Anglican tradition. So that would have been requiring to look a little more priestly as you went to class. And William Penn protested. He said, I'm not putting on those garments. He'd become enough of a, let's say, a Puritan that he didn't want it. Well, he got kicked out of school. Now let me tell you, when your father's the admiral who brought back the exiled king on his ship, and his son is being kicked out for standing against that king's church, it was an explosive moment.
That sure was.
All right, well, he sent him off to France. He got him straightened up. But he studied under another theologian, a man named Moses Amyro. Some theologians will recognize him as a father of four-point Calvinism. So he was a Calvinist, but not quite as strict as classic Calvinism, but that was part of it. He came back, And just about the time he returned, all the problems of London came out. The Black Plague, the burning of the city with fire. And Penn was totally distraught. And I think it caused him to be willing to hear a street preacher by the name of Thomas Lowe, who was a Quaker preacher. Remember, in this time, to be a street preacher, to do what we're doing here on the street, speaking about spiritual things, was illegal. You had to do it in the church.
In a church.
And you needed a license, not from a presbytery or a bishop, but from the king. And he was breaking that law. And I think Penn was so struck with someone having that courage, he stopped to listen. And Thomas Lowe's message went like this: there's a faith that is overcome by the world, and there's a faith that overcomes the world. Which is yours?
It's quite a challenge.
And he said his heart was struck with the power of that. And he said, I'm tired of just going with the flow of whatever the culture wants. And he said, I'm going to become a Quaker.
Now, if I remember, wasn't the word Quaker actually originally almost a criticism or a way of making fun of them?
Yeah, that's good. So you go back to the beginning of the Quaker movement. They originally called themselves the Friends. So the father of that was a man named George Fox. George Fox is in this time of the English Reformation, and he was in the Puritan tradition, but he didn't like the fact that the church had not reformed enough, and he wasn't sure they really understood the Bible. And he had what he felt was a revelation from God, a spiritual awakening of his own, that said, we're going to wait and just trust God to bring us the truth. And so some describe the Quakers or the Friends as radical Puritans. Not only did they reject everything that was Roman Catholic, they rejected everything that was, let's say, Protestant outwardly. So when you went to a Quaker meeting, there's no preaching. You never hear a bad sermon in a Quaker meeting house. There's no outward speaking or singing. There's no baptism with water. There's no communion. It's all done inside by the Holy Spirit. There's a famous moment where William Penn, years later, was in a Quaker meeting house. He invited a friend, and they sat there in silence. And then finally he said, Mr. Penn, when does the service start?
When does it start?
And he said, when we leave, this is where we worship. The service is when we go preach on the streets and tell people about their need for God.
That's amazing.
Isn't that amazing? So what made this movement what it was? Well, the way George Fox, the first father of the Quakers, understood it, he said, Jesus in the Gospel of John calls people friends. And may I have your hat for a moment?
Certainly.
Your hat is perfectly situated. So when a nobleman came and had a hat like you are, and I was just a peon, I'd have to take off my hat and say, sir.
Mm-hmm.
And William Penn and the Quakers with George Fox said, we can't do that. Friends don't take off their hats to friends. I've been waiting for you to take off your hat and bow to me, and you haven't done it. You don't do that to friends. If the King of Kings and Lord of Lords said everyone is his friend, then that's our church. And so they wanted to, but when they preached, they had such passion. They quaked, and that's where they got the name Quaker.
You Quakers.
The tremulous preaching, the passion out of quietness of worship to the powerful.
But that had a
preaching.
great impact then, and certainly in calling this place Philadelphia, a city of brotherly love, that everyone is accepted, everyone is received as friends.
That's well said. And so as you think about that, then this becomes known as the Quaker City. Religious liberty, welcoming everyone into the friendly communion. And the Quaker movement was early on trying to emphasize the right of slaves, the education of women, the abolition of persecution of the insane, that we need medical help. They were ahead of their time in so many ways because of their commitment to the friendship of humanity.
And to think that they would have gotten persecuted with that mindset.
Yeah,
So the broad-brimmed hatters, or whatever they called them, were looked down upon, when in fact they really were trying to live out the teachings of the Master.
And that's why that broad-brimmed hat becomes such a symbol of the Quakers. They wouldn't take their hat off. So if you look at a box of Quaker oats, if you look at the statue of William Penn, it was a mark.
He's not holding his hat.
That's right.
He has his hat on.
We keep our hat on because we're all friends. It was a symbol. And so what's amazing then is that this man who had such courage, he abandoned all of his history, was the one his father ends up saying, I will restore my relationship with you. And there's a reason for that. Because William Penn went on to be a street preacher. He was in the Tower of London, and while he was in the Tower of London is when he had this epiphany of saying, what would the world be like if everyone had freedom of conscience, but differences of religion, but could still be part of the society, being an active, respected. That was his dream. It came from the golden rule of Jesus: do unto others as you have them do unto you. And so he had that vision, but he was street preaching and he got arrested, and there's a great scene. The story goes like this: he is now arrested, and there is going to be a trial. He comes before the judge. He's in England. The law says you need to have a license, you need to be in a church, and you don't have a license, you're on the street, you're guilty. And William Penn says to the judge, "Sir, I know the law. The Magna Carta requires that there be a jury. I need to be tried by my peers." And he said, "You are guilty." He said, "The law says you must." And he compelled, because he'd been trained in law. He forced a jury trial. And so the jury trial comes along, and now they're hearing it. And the judge has the impaneled jury. William Penn's on trial, the street preacher, this heretic Quaker. And he says, "You must find him guilty. He has no license. He's preaching." And William Penn says, "Wait a second. You must look at the law. And jury, when you look at the law, you have the right to determine whether it's just or not just at all. You must decide." And the judge says, "Quiet that man. Send him out of my court." And William Penn says, "The Magna Carta says that you must decide whether the law is just or not. You are the jury." And so, an amazing moment in English legal history. The jury hears the case, and they go out and say, "This law is not just." And they come back and they say to the judge, "We find him innocent for unjust law." He said, "You shall go to jail, and we shall not feed you until you change your mind." And it became a cause célèbre. And finally, he lets them out, and they find him innocent.
Still find him innocent.
And William Penn, in that act of courage, establishes, if you will, the right of English citizens for a trial jury, and it becomes one of the Bill of Rights principles that we have. And that was from a Quaker preacher standing for his conscience. Now, all of that happened, just as I remember, a little bit before his father's death, and his father realized the impact of his son. He disagreed in religion, but he was proud of his son. He said, "You are my heir." And so when that action happened, and now Pennsylvania becomes a reality, he says to the king, "This will always be a place that is to be under the kingship, but let me write the laws." And so he writes the laws that provide a beginning and end with religious liberty. He said that shall be perpetual.
And so all different religious affiliations are welcomed here.
That's exactly right. So we find historic Roman Catholic, historic Jewish centers, plus even us Presbyterians snuck in. It's kind of amazing. But that was all done.
That's a foundational principle of America.
Yeah. And so I think William Penn has taught us all to be Quakers in the sense of respecting conscience. It's an amazing thing.
Many people I talk to and start raising William Penn's name, so many of us don't know anything about him, but he's really a founder's founder. I mean, before the group of founders that we identify as founders, William Penn really established some really basic principles upon which we live together as a nation.
We can go to our founding era and we can think of Washington and Jefferson. It's hard to think of two more important founding fathers. George Washington, when he was traveling through, was struck at the size and of this beautiful city of Philadelphia. He was amazed, and he realized it was different from Virginia that had an established church. He said, "This thing is working. Look at all these,
How about
the
that?
business.
Yeah.
I get the best clothes I want in this city, and it's Penn City." Thomas Jefferson, when he writes his history of Virginia, will say Virginia has never grown the way Philadelphia has grown, because we have an established church that keeps everybody out. But Philadelphia has found a way to bring together all of everyone. And he recognized the brilliance of what William Penn had established.
That's extraordinary.
It was a utopian dream that in God's providence became a reality. So when Penn writes out his insights, there's some basic truths that we should not forget. Number one is that he said, not only will there be religious liberty here for everyone who comes, but he also says that in my city, we are going to make sure that there is education for those that need opportunity. So there's freedom for people to learn. The slaves are being freed to taught. Those kind of laws were banished here. And William Penn also, as he establishes his frame of government, has a couple of keen insights. He says, take a government, be it ever so good, if the people be evil, they will corrupt it. Take the government, be it ever so bad, if the people be good, they shall perfect it or correct it. And so what he was saying is that the moral nature of the people will make the Constitution possible. And when he comes here, he says, this is a holy experiment. And I pray to my God that it will be the seed of a nation. Guess what? It's the seed of a nation, and our nation was born here. And when George Washington took his inaugural address, he said, the experiment in American liberty, the sacred fire of liberty, has been entrusted to the American people. He uses the same word experiment as Penn did. There's a rippling effect of ideas, and William Penn was a key person. And so, as Christians, we often think prison epistles are very powerful. Well, William Penn's book on the conscience, written in the Tower of London, changed the world.
Well, he certainly was a man of prayer, and you mentioned his prayer earlier. When one of the times he went back to London, he wanted to pray a blessing on this colony. So there in this statue, he's reaching out his hand to bless the colony, but in his prayer, he asked God's blessing. Well, let's go and see how he prayed.
Let's do that.
And thou, Philadelphia, the virgin settlement of this province, named before thou wert born, what love, what care, what service, what travail have there been to bring thee forth and preserve thee from such as would abuse and defile thee? Oh, that thou may be kept from the evil that would overwhelm thee, that faithful to God of thy mercies, in the life of righteousness, thou mayest be preserved to the end. My soul prays to God for thee, that thou mayest stand in thy day of trial, that thy children may be blessed of the Lord, and thy people saved by his power. My love to thee has been great, and the remembrance of thee affects mine heart and mine eye. The God of eternal strength keep and preserve thee to his glory and thy peace. What a beautiful prayer.
That's right. And so when you look at that, it's interesting. There's two great principles of the Quaker movement that are at the end. They were pacifists. And so his last word is peace. The biblical word is shalom.
Shalom.
He's saying shalom. And his glory, the humility of the follower of God. All glory to God.
It glorifies him.
Not us, not what I've done, but God's glory. God's glory bringing peace. And it comes about through brothers loving each other. When you look at that language, it say that thou mayest stand in the day of trial. He's picking up some of the language of Revelation 3 to Jesus' letter to the church in Philadelphia. But people have often wondered, what was he suggesting? What would be the day of trial? Perhaps it was the day when they heard the news that they lost at the Battle of Brandywine, where Congress had to flee. The army was coming to march in to take over the city. The city without walls, a city of peace, had no one to defend them, and all seemed to be lost. And yet the city was preserved. The Liberty Bell had to flee as well as Congress, but it came back, and here we are, and it became the birthplace of a nation after all.
And we should also note that the embracing of people as friends was not only just so many people of different Christian denominations, but also, as you mentioned, Jewish friends are welcome and others. But he also had a very profound impact on the people's attitude toward the Native Americans. He had a very good rapport with the Native Americans that live here, wanted to live with them in peace.
That's well said. And that's why when the language of a city without walls, you'd think, well, we're in a new world, we got to protect ourselves. No, he said we're going to find a way to live at peace. And so the covenants that he made with the Indians stood entirely in his lifetime. There never was any war. If there was a problem, they sat down and worked it out together. He never took any land. He always bought the land. Even though he was given it by the king, he said, that's not enough. You've occupied this land. I need to compensate you for it. So William Penn was a man who was not only ahead of his time, dreaming of a nation, dreaming of diplomacy with enemies through peace. He was also the first person to propose that there be a European Union, whether it's successful or not. He said the day needs to come, instead of European nations fighting all the time,
right,
that they would come together and he proposed that. So what a brilliant man he was. And the amazing thing of that, this was outflow of his biblical ideas applied to culture. He said, I want a city where brothers love each other, where God is glorified, where there is peace, where conscience is protected, and it will become a seed of a nation. And lo and behold, America at its best is described by
And
William
these are
Penn's
issues
vision.
that we're even dealing with today.
That's right. Well said.
A man well before his time.
That's right.